name is Amy Solomon. I am here to present Bob McLaughlin. Did I pronounce it correctly?
You got it, McLaughlin, that's right.
McLaughlin,
Yep.
excellent.
Very
He
cool.
is a local author, I believe, from Wakefield?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Yes. And has written 5 books. Did I get that number right?
You get 5.
See what I can remember up here. On some of the history of small theme parks in the United States. But tonight we are here for 128, and Bob has brought a lot of awesome visuals up here.
Smaller, bigger theme parks, really big,
Big
Oh,
theme parks?
big,
Okay,
big,
sorry,
big.
but I...
That's okay, that's
That
okay.
was like-
No, actually, yeah, I did a book on Pleasure Island in Wakefield.
I was going to mention
Yeah,
it. You
2
may
of
have seen
those.
him last year.
2 books on Freedom Land out in the Bronx. That was the biggest park in the world, bigger than Disneyland when they built it.
Okay,
And
we
then
gotta
one
change this
out in Golden, Colorado, which was pretty big, but you know, they had some financial problems, so that didn't really make it. But anyway, welcome to 128. Did anybody, by the way, did anybody drive down 128 today?
93.
Did you see any accidents? It's not a matter of whether it's going to be an accident, it's going to be where's the accident going to be. That's kind of what it is. So a couple of things I wanted to do right out of the gate is I'm a newbie on this 128 thing here. I've been doing Pleasure Island for 25 years. I've done dozens and dozens of these talks. But 128 is kind of fun, and so I kind of thought, I talked to where's Masha? Hi, Masha. Right. I talked to Marsha when we finished last year, about a year and a half ago. We were over here doing Pleasure Island. I said, Marsha, you want to do something on 128 if you have a light in the loafer for speakers? So Marsha says, absolutely, because I charge so much money. She says, I'll be more than happy to have you over here. Okay. So, if you really want to learn something about Pleasure Island, excuse me, that's my book. 128, this book right here. It's written by Yanni Tippis, T-S-I-P-I-S, and David Kruth. K-R-U-H. This is the book you want to get right here. Okay, it's got great photographs, and actually David's got on YouTube. He's got a great talk that he does for. I think he did it for the libraries, and it's about an hour long. And he's got all his photos in here, and he does a really good job. He does a better job than I think I'm going to do, but anyway, we'll see how that goes. And then there's also a book that Yanni Tippis did himself, and this is on the building of the Massachusetts Turnpike, which is also very interesting. It all ties in, but these are, if you're at home, you can get these on Amazon, find them on eBay, Arcadia Publishing, they may have some. And while we're doing a show and tell, if you're at an antique store sometime and you see some maps, you can get these things for like $5 or $6, a couple of bucks. I get them all the time, and it's really interesting to see how these highways have changed. Going back to, this one's from the 30s, and you can, there is no well, I'm going to tell you, there is a 128, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And so it's kind of fun, so if you happen to see these poking around in an antique shop, you can grab some of those things. What else have I got here? Service plazas on the Mass Pike and 128. I just happened to grab, believe it or not, I got these 20 years ago. All right, but that shows out, it has all the different restaurants in there, and of course those have changed over the years every time you go in there. And if you've never heard of the Lincoln Highway, has anybody heard of the Lincoln Highway?
Sure.
Yes. There you go. Terry, oh, that's my wife over here. Hi, Terry. Anyway, Terry and I, we actually drove the Lincoln Highway. We took it to, we started in Pennsylvania. We picked it up in Pennsylvania, and we took it all the way to Denver. And it's called the Denver Loop. So this goes through 13 states. And it was developed in 1913. It was the first transcontinental road that went from point A to point B. We had a train that went out there, but we didn't have a road. So they cobbled together a bunch of the roads, signed it, actually they put posts in there with a big L, Lincoln Highway, Lincoln Highway, Lincoln Highway. And it took you right up to San Francisco. And symbolically, it started in Times Square in New York City. And it landed in a park out in San Francisco. Very, very cool. And so it still exists. So if you want to take Lincoln Highway, it's like taking Route 28 to California. Right? So, but it shares a lot of the roads, because of the different generations and over the years. It shares. Sometimes you're back up on a highway, then you get back off again. But you get the. It's kind of like Route 66. Well, let's see if I get the show here. I brought a little show and tell if you want to look at this stuff later. This is the Central Artery Tunnel Project. It's not just building a highway. It's not just building a highway in Boston. Oh, sure it is. It is very, very cool. But this is stuff that I picked up, you know, when they were doing the big dig. So there was a lot of literature. They had tons of this stuff out there. And so I'm not really a hoarder, but I'm kind of a collector. And so what I was going to do here, I have a little gyp sheet, and what I wanted to do, first of all, is thank the Historical Society and Amy for having me here, and we'll just put your seatbelts on and let's see what the hell happens. We're gonna, I am gonna show, I have a Chronicle tape that we're gonna show that Chronicle did for the 50th anniversary of 128. Back in 2000, it came out in October of 2000, and we're gonna watch about maybe 6 or 7 minutes of it. I'll throw that on a little bit as we go through this thing. And when we do that, we're gonna turn Mr. Camera off because this is copyrighted. It's Chronicle on Channel 5, so we're just gonna turn the camera off. So, but everything else will fly. But I did want to first of all talk about two guys that were involved with all the transportation around here in that era. One was William Callahan. Anybody ever heard of William Callahan?
Of course, in the tunnel.
Okay. Yeah, well, Callahan Tunnel is named after his son, who died in World War II. His son got killed just before the war was ending, and got killed, and so that tunnel was named after him. But Bill Callahan, he was born in 1891, and he died in 1964. Sadly, in 1964, because in 1965 the Mass Pike extension got completed, so he didn't quite make it to the tail end. He died just before it was all done. But he was the commissioner of Public Works, Massachusetts Public Works, for about 11 years, from 1934 all the way to 53, and there was a few years that he wasn't in there, something. But one of his a couple of accomplishments was we had 2 major highways that he redeveloped. This is before the 128 project. Route 1, which is the Newburyport Turnpike, all the way from Boston all the way up. He did a lot of work. They widened the roads. They did a lot of work on that stuff. That's not what you call a limited access highway. That's called sagas with a drive at every 2 feet. And as soon as you get out there, you got to go 150 miles an hour. You're going to get rear-ended. So that is a crazy, crazy road. But anyway, and he did the same thing with Route 9. That's that turnpike too. So those are 2 big transportation modes of getting up to north and going out to west. So that Route 9 and Route 1. Do you know Route 1 was a toll road going back to the early 1800s, and as Route 9 was, and so well Route 28 was too, exactly. So what happened was the counties or the state would eventually buy those toll roads and then make them public roads, but they started out as toll roads. Right. While we're at it, Route 28 was a toll road, all the way from Medford, all the way right up to the state line back in the early 1800s. Does anybody have any idea how long that road is? Route 28, where it starts and where it ends?
It goes down to the Cape.
All the way down to the Cape, down to Wareham, down the Cape, and it ends in Ossipee, New Hampshire. If you hopped on Route 28 down, almost to Provincetown actually, if you hopped onto Route 28, you could go to Ossipee, New Hampshire. That was 1922. They designated it as a state highway. So we've come a long way here, boys and girls. So anyway, Mr. Callahan, he was the chairman of the Massachusetts after he did a lot of work with the commission, including the 1948 master plan I was just showing you guys about, a couple of guys about. He did Route 1 and Route 9, but of course Route 128. He was instrumental in getting that thing out of the ground. He was really that was his baby, and he did the northern section of 128, and he did the what they call the western section of 128, which was the 22-mile loop that opened August 23rd, 1951, all the way from Route 9 all the way to the Lynnfield line. Now, we're going to get to the history of that in a few minutes, but I just wanted to just say that he was also the chairman of the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority from 1952 all the way to 1963, excuse me, 64. That's when he passed away. So he put together that whole massive 123 miles. They built that in about a year and a half. It was pretty cool, pretty quick and pretty fast. But 123 miles of just blasting and taking trees down and moving buildings and tearing buildings down, all the way from 128 all the way out to the New York line. And then he went back in and did the extension into Boston. So he was pretty instrumental. So we're gonna give him an attaboy. And then another individual, it was a guy named John Vopey, who everybody remembers him as the governor. Okay. Well, anyway, John Vopey, he was born in 1908, right in Wakefield, Massachusetts, right down the street from where I live. And in fact, there's a plaque on the building. They tore the building down that he was born in a few years ago. It's across from S&M Liquors on Water Street, and there's a plaque right on that building that he was the governor. Doesn't mention anything about 128, but anyway, he passed away in 1994, and he's in Forest Glade Cemetery over in Wakefield, just a whisper from 128 that they built. Right, so he was involved with 128 also. Oh, by the way, he was also a lieutenant commander in the Seabees during World War II, and I was in the Seabees, but I wasn't in World War II. But anyway, but we're both Seabees. I just found that out. So he was also the commissioner of the Public Works. He took over when Bill Callahan went to the Turnpike to do the Massachusetts Turnpike. So what Mr. Vopey did, John Vopey did, was he took over the southern section of 128 and finished it. So he went from Route 9 all the way to the expressway and got that all done. And then he was also he was the first administrator of the Federal Highway Administration from 1956 to 57, which came in really handy when we needed the money in Massachusetts, because he was the administrator for the whole country and putting that whole interstate system together. So he was pretty impressive, and then became the governor of Massachusetts in 61, and he was from 61 to 63. He had a 2-year term. I think it was Sargent that came, no, it wasn't Sargent, I forget who came in between him, and then he grabbed the governorship from 65 to 69. He grabbed the first 4-year term as the governor of Massachusetts. And then he went on to become the Secretary of Transportation under Nixon from 69 to 73, and then the ambassador to Italy from 73 to 77. The guy had nothing to do. It was crazy. So yes.
So he, in his family, had a business, a construction business.
A huge construction
business. That my neighbor on Lindor Road, Fred Dobson, was an engineer for. And Fred was fortunate to get license plates that were the very first editions of the F4, Fred 4, and V45, whatever, for his wife. So my neighbor was an engineer in his firm, and when I grew up, I remember visiting his house in Winchester many times to see the beautiful columns of his very palatial home in Winchester.
Yeah, his father had the construction company, and then he took it over. Right. My understanding is his sister-in-law lived right across the street from us, Bedovetto. And but anyway, he was a big player. So between these two guys right here, there's your 128 and all, everything that was. It was so much stuff going on. It's hard to believe how many highways they were building, all at the same time here. So why don't we talk about we're going to talk about the old 128, not the new, the 28 that's out, the 128 that's out there right now is one story, but the old 128 is pretty cool too. So going back, I think before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about how people transported themselves around here before we even got into the cars. It's an interesting story, and it kind of goes back to the 1600s. What was happening was when everybody came, when the settlers came over from Europe, they left their homes that had roads. They had roads for centuries over in Europe, and when they got over here, they didn't have any roads, but there were certainly trails, and the trails were probably a couple, they were thousands of years old too. A lot of these trails, And so they adapted to these trails. And so if you can imagine, for instance, living in North Reading and having to get to downtown Wakefield, where they had built a parish church, and getting in your ox cart and going through this little trail all the way over there to Wakefield on a Sunday. Oh, bye, Chris. Thank you so much.
I wasn't going to go to sleep on you.
Okay. Thank you. And this is Chris. This is my AV person. Thank you, Chris.
But I have to go be mom now, so.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it was very, very difficult for people to get around when they started these trails, and eventually these trails turned into be wider paths, and then eventually roads, okay? But a lot of these roads that we like, the Mohawk Trail, and a lot of these roads, they eventually developed into transportation to get from village to village, from village to other villages. A lot of people had, farmers, they wanted to get their goods out to different markets. So the road system in New England really started out here. It was a little weird because you're going to go around swamps, you're going to go around ledge, and that's why some of these roads that we ride on this very day, they were all trails that they started out hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And so we ended up from the trails to eventually the Boston Post roads, and those roads connected to regions far, far away from where the settlement was that we're in right now. There was basically three Boston Post roads that left Boston. One of them went out to New York, one went down into Connecticut, and one went down into like Providence, Rhode Island, which is really the makeup for the Route 1 that went all the way down the East Coast, and that was called the King's Highway. And these roads came in really handy during the Revolutionary War, which we're going to be having a little anniversary in about, 9 days? And so that was the makeup. So, and then of course on those roads they would have taverns and the businesses and commerce. But the reason they called them post roads was because that was for the postal service to get mail and newspapers and everything else that they had in the day from point A to point B. That's why they call it post office. It was post roads, post office. And it was very, 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 very interesting how they did that. And then, of course, from there, what was the next little thing that we had around? We had a canal, Middlesex Canal, that connected the Merrimack River to the Boston Harbor, and that was hand dug. They started that canal they put that corporation together in 1793, and they had that thing dug by 1803. And they hired farmers, and they just dug a trench, and that went all the way through. And they had, I think there were like 30 locks. In fact, there's a museum up in North Billerica, the Middlesex Canal Association. I belonged to this thing for like 25 years, and it's a very, very interesting little piece of work that they did. But they had canals, and of course they were moving lumber from the Merrimack Valley down to the harbor, and then they were bringing stuff back. They actually had packet boats that they had. It was literally like a little tourist boat. You could take a little canal ride up from Boston all the way up, and of course you thought you were up in Canada by the time you got there, but that's what it was. And they had tow paths. Okay, so they had the horses. Oh, somebody. That was something. So that was the canal. So that was a way of people getting around. And then eventually the railroad came in. In fact, they built the railroad parallel to the Middlesex Canal in 1835 to 38. And believe it or not, that railroad pretty much put that canal out of business, because by the time the railroad started coming in the 1850s in Wakefield and all over the place around here, it was putting put the canals right out of business, because the canals couldn't work. They couldn't operate obviously in the wintertime, right? Among other things, so the trains were so much more efficient. And then we get into the streetcars, trolleys. There were horse-drawn trolleys that would get people from point A to point B. And then the electric trolleys came in 1888, and you could take a trolley to Portland, Maine. You just keep on getting connection after connection after connection, and people would take the trolleys to Canby Lake, or but primarily. They'd take the trolleys. Well, after the turn of the century, people were taking the trolleys to the factories. And there was that one day that they didn't work was on Sunday, and the trolley companies developed trolley parks. That's where Canby Lake came from, to use those trolleys on that off day, so they could they could generate income. And and those, of course, the trolleys got kicked out of there when the General Motors or somebody, I forget what, I don't want to get sued here, but somebody came up with an idea to get rid of those trolleys and bring buses in. Okay, there was some lawsuits over that, but anyway, the buses finally came in the 30s, and that was the end of the trolleys, which is kind of too bad because they were kind of fun. So what do we? Okay, so now we're into the trolleys. Okay. Oh, what's that other thing that came? Oh, automobiles. That's what we're talking about. Okay. I knew there was a reason for this. Okay. We get into I might have missed a couple of things here, scooters, pogo sticks, or something. But the automobiles came in, and so by 1910. I think maybe, I don't know how many, maybe 1 out of 100 people might have had a car in Massachusetts, something like that. But the MDC at the time, which is now DCR, but the MDC decided they were going to build some parkways, some pleasure roads for the automobiles, and they weren't going to allow any trucks, and they weren't going to go through the city centers, but they were going to be cute little roads that the family could go for a nice little ride on. And Parkway was constructed by that term Parkway was from Olmsted, and I can't pronounce his partner's name, some other guy from France or something. But anyway, they came up with that word Parkway. Park being the wooded areas that the roads are going to be on, and then the way, which is the way is a street or a lane. It's a way. That's just another name for it. Look it up in the dictionary, boys and girls. So that's where the parkways came from. So they developed about 30 of these parkways. Furnace Brook Parkway, you always hear them on the news or for the traffic reports. Furnace Brook Parkway, Revere Beach Parkway, Starrow Drive was a parkway. They had a bunch of these things, and they're still around. Except they're not exactly a pleasure road. As a matter of fact, it's a death trap. Like the Jamaica Way is absolutely insane. Right, so
Alewife Brook Park.
Alewife Brook, all those things. But they were built by the Olmsted brothers. Okay, Frederick Law Olmsted's 2 sons. And if we have time, we're going to talk about the Quanah Power Parkway right over here in Wakefield. We'll see how Babel and Bob does. So that was the so we got to the parkways, and that happened in the early 1910s, 11s, right around in that area. And then the Massachusetts Public Works decided by about 1920 that we got a problem here, okay? Because all of a sudden there's a bunch of cars, and the roads were very inadequate. And the cars were going through these town centers, and it was just jamming up everything, and it was just crazy. And of course, the co-mingling for a while there with horses and wagons, right? And then you got the trolleys going through here. It must have been a train wreck, trying to get around. But they co-mingled. But the biggest problem was Boston, trying to get through from getting from the South Shore up to the North Shore, and trying to get through Boston. Was nearly impossible. So they realized at about the mid-20s, they really realized that they had a problem in their hands. And that's when they started thinking about doing a circumvental, I can't pronounce that word, circle around Boston. Right, it was basically a beltway. From now on, we're going to call it beltway. I can pronounce that. So they were going to do a beltway, just like the beltway down in Washington D.C. Many cities have the beltways to get around it because going through those cities is absolutely nearly impossible. So it's like like a wheel with spokes. So you've got the wheel is the beltway going around the city, and the spokes is all the roads, radical roads, I can't pronounce that. Radical. Yeah. Radical roads that come out of the city, and they just head out like this, just like a spoke in a wheel. Yeah. And so, as you know, we've got basically, I'm going to jump to it. We got 2 beltways. We have 128 is the beltway outside, and then the longer, far away beltway is 495. That was all designed back in the 1948 master plan. They wanted 2 of these radical roads, radial roads, going around the city, 2 beltways. And so the interconnecting roads that take you out of the city or into the city, would be, I'm just going to, 93s, Route 2, Route 3, Route 20, the Mass Pike, all those roads. So you basically get roads going through, and you can cut and you can slice and dice, and you can hop onto one, go down 495, pick up another one, which is what we do all day long. But these planners really had their hands full, because we're dealing basically with a lot of the road systems that were already in place. They couldn't take land everywhere they really made a lot of sense, but they had to go with where the roads were, okay? And they had to work with what they had. And so again, we're going back to these old Indian trails way, way back when, and they did the best they could. So anyway, we got the probably a good time to be talking about the old 128. So back in the mid-20s, when they were trying to get people around Boston, they knew they weren't going to be able to get that road built, the one that we're talking about tonight, 128. But they already had existing roads. So what they did was they got a pencil out, and they got a map, and they went down to the sign shop, and they made a ton of these signs that says 128, and they plugged them all over the place, all the way from Hull all the way up to Gloucester. And for an example, if you wanted to go through Wakefield, 128 was going through Wakefield, and this is back in the 1930s when they started putting the signs up. So if you were coming up from the south, and say you're cutting into Stoneham, so you go down Lynnfield Avenue, that was 128 back in the 1930s. And actually 1930s and 1940s right up till 1953, 51 when they opened 128 up. So you go down Lynnfield Avenue, and then you take a left on 28, and then you take a right on Elm Street in Stoneham, which connects to Albion Street. Then you go down Albion Street. And by the way, if anybody remembers, if you were ever on Albion Street, Bear Hill Golf Course is over here, and you go down Albion Street, there was a gas station on the corner of Jordan Ave and Albion Street, which didn't make any sense to me for all these years I've lived in Wakefield, because it's in a residential area. Nobody could figure out why that gas station was there. And when I was doing a caption for the town calendar for 128 this year, and it dawned on me, that was 128. That's why there was a gas station there back in the 1930s. And so these gas stations, these filling stations were popping up all over the place, where 128 kind of wiggled its way through all these town centers. So you go down Albion Street to North Ave, where the old Friendlies was, and you take a right on North Ave, and take a left on West Water Street, and you go shoot right across the street where Hart's Hardware is, and you go right straight across on Water Street, and then take a left on Vernon Street where the cement company is, and then take a right on New Salem Street, and that took you to Salem Street, and that took you to Lynnfield. That's how they get you through. And that was 128. They had 128 signs all over the place. And that worked, and it worked for quite a few years, okay? So if you were going from the South Shore, going up to the North Shore, or vice versa, at least you had a route that you didn't have to go through Boston. That must have been crazy, because there's train tracks, there's everything you can imagine was going on at that time. So that got the 128 up until up to the point where they actually decided to, when they could put the money together, and the time, of course, we're going through the depressions in the 30s, but they got that thing started in 1938, and they started building 128 in 1938. From the Lynnfield Peabody area, right? That's exactly where they started to connect. They wanted to connect on Route 1. It's basically that whole thing. It was called the Road to Nowhere, because they built a bridge up in Peabody, and there was nothing there. There's nothing on either side of the bridge. But eventually they had the master plan. They knew exactly what they were doing, but they couldn't do the whole thing at once. And as they were grabbing money, and this is Callahan doing all this stuff, right? So they got the so that was the northern sector, the northern section of the highway. So they built that all the way from the Lynnfield line up into Beverly and Danvers, and then we had World War II, and they put all the highway construction was paused, and it didn't start back up again until really around 1949, I believe, is when they really kicked in with the concept to get this whole 128 thing done, point A to point B, and so. They, 1949, Callahan, he's a busy little bee, right? And they're building other stuff at the same time, and they're getting the matter of fact, they were even actually doing work out for the Mass Pike back in the early 50s, before they even started the Mass Pike. on one of the bridges, way out by Sturbridge someplace, past that. So he ended up getting the northern sector going, but then they stopped, went back to where Route 9 is, and they built this one piece. It was 22.5 miles long. That was called the western section, and that thing went rolling all the way around from Route 9 all the way to the Lynnfield line. And they finished that, opened it up they had a grand opening on August 23rd, 1951, with a big parade. And this guy right here, excuse me, you were in that parade, right?
No, I was hanging on the fence at 8 years old, watched that.
You weren't throwing anything at these people, were you?
I was too young to be vicious.
Well, we have somebody here that was there. I certainly wasn't. But anyway, well, good for you. Do you remember anything about that?
Like it was yesterday, but you know, like I told you, I think it was going west. And, you know, I was too young to know anything about politics. I'm sure the governor was there, whoever the governor was.
It was Deaver, Governor Deaver, and William Callan. Dever. Deaver. Anyway, he's not going to complain. So, but it was, the governor was there. It wasn't just the governor; it was everybody was there. They had antique cars. It was a big parade. They had a celebration at every one of the every one of the towns. Forget the number of towns that we're going through, but you can figure it out. All the way from Route 9 in Wellesley, all the way up to Lynnfield. They actually had a big luncheon at the Town Line restaurant. Is that the Town Line? Yeah. Suntone. The Suntone. Yeah. Which is where Spinelli's is. They had a big banquet hall up there, so they had a big celebration over there. So that was a very, very big deal. So that was and we're going to watch a little bit about this in a couple of minutes here. But that was and then of course. Callahan went and he started the Mass Pike. They built that in 55 to 57. It took a little less than 2 years to get the Mass Pike, 123 miles all the way to the New York line. They had to cut a lot of trees down. They had to move a lot of houses. They had to burn a lot. They trashed some stuff, but they were going through farms. They literally had to go in a beeline all the way out to the New York line, and that was a toll road. And they got that in before the 1956 financing came in. That was 90% financing that came from the federal government for highways. So they actually the state funded that with a bond. And so that was Callahan's. That was his thing. And then they went back and did the extension into Boston. That was 62 to 65. And that was very, very difficult because they had to get all the way from the Mass Pike right into where the Prudential Center is, and onto the expressway. They had to do a lot of land taking, and they tore a lot of stuff down to get that thing in there. But going back to 128, this is when Volpe comes into the picture. So Callahan leaves the 128 project. He's out doing the Mass Pike. So Volpe comes in. He takes care of the rest of he goes all the way from Route 9 all the way to the expressway. All right, so that was I think they finished that in 58 totally, but that was also a very difficult job down there too. But that gets you the whole route, and of course, they went all the way up to Gloucester. They connected on to 127. That's the beginning, and then the expressway's the other end right there. So so why don't we watch a little bit of Chronicle here? So I'm going to talk about a little bit. Bye bye. Okay. So that was fun. Okay, we're back. A little side story on this. Was anybody at my little Pleasure Island presentation last year?
Yeah.
Right. Do you remember when I showed that Chronicle piece about Pleasure Island? The guy that produced that, I met him. I'm an electrician. I was working on a job in Brookline, and his mother had come over to this project I was working on, looking for electrician. So I went over there. I ended up doing some work for this guy's mother. So he came over one day to say hi to his mom, and we got into this "what do you do" thing. And he says, "Well, I'm a writer, but I produce a little bit for Chronicle." And I says, so at the time, we were just putting this Friends of Pleasure Island thing together. So I asked him if he would do if Chronicle was interested in doing something with us. So Chronicle did. They did a piece with us, and shortly after that, that was 2000, it came out in 2000 also. I think I was on the bridge going out to the Cape on a project I was working on. And it occurred to me, it was April of 2000, I called Tony up, this guy Tony Hill. I says, Tony, I says, you know, 128 is going to be 50 years old August 23rd. Actually, it was 2001, and when I called him up, going over the bridge, and I says, do you think Quanah would be interested in doing it? He says, I don't really think so, but he says, I'll ask anyway. Well, they did a whole half hour of that. So I gave this guy, Al Millett, that was just on this little film. He lived in Wakefield, and I knew he worked for the department, the Mass Highway way back when. And so we got him involved. And then Jerry Blakely, his company built Pleasure Island. His construction company built Pleasure Island. They owned the land that Pleasure Island was built on, because this was one of his little land deals that he had up in Wakefield Industrial Center. Pleasure Island was the first tenant in that industrial center, and then of course it was full of buildings. Continental Can went in there, AC Spark Plug went in there. There was a whole bunch of different corporations that Jerry built in that facility. And then Jerry went on to, his company was a co-builder of Freedom Land out in the Bronx that I ended up doing a couple of books on with Turner Construction. So Jerry was involved with a lot of different things, but this was his best dream come true. He got a hold of that 48 master plan, and those guys went up and bought all that land before the highway was even built, and so he got into the game. They did very, very well over there. Anyway, what I wanted to do is explain just a little bit of a timeline of how much stuff was going on all at the same time when they were building this stuff. The Northern Expressway, this is what they called it then, but this was 93, was whipping through Boston. They built that from 1956 to 1963, all the way from Medford, all the way up to the New Hampshire line, the big 93 that we go on. So that's just a little timeline of what was going on with the rest of them. Also, the Outer Belt, 495. They built that from 1958 all the way to 1982. It took a long time to get that thing in, but that was the Outer Belt. That was all going on at the same time. And then the Inner Belt, which got canceled in 1972. We just saw a little bit of that on the film. It was just the environmentalists got in there, and the people were just they were going to tear a hole right through Cambridge to get. Basically, they were going to bring in 95 was going to go right straight through Boston. That's what the Inner Belt was all about, and connect up to where it is up in PVD and up in going up into Newburyport, all the way up there. So what they did was, in 1974, they went back down to that sign shop that they did for the original 128 signs, and they made a ton more of 128 signs, and then they went over to 128, and they put the 95 signs. They made a bunch of 95 signs. They went and slapped them all the way down 128. So basically they took 128 and made that the interstate, right? Because the environmentalists and everybody else wouldn't let them go through Boston, and that's basically what happened. So they took a road that was designed just to get traffic around Boston. Not an interstate, but just a road to go around Boston. Or you could hop, like in Wakefield, you go from one exit, I can get on a couple of more exits and hop, you can kind of cut through your own town. The way that they built the limited access, but you can certainly, they have enough access you can get around. So anyway, so they basically turned 128 into an interstate. So surprise, 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 where all this traffic's coming from, okay, including the tractor-trailer trucks and everything else. It wasn't designed, this road was not designed for that. So then they started widening. Of course, they started widening it like Al Millett was talking about. They started widening almost immediately, back especially in the biggest part of it was in the early 60s, particularly right here. When you guys come up to North Reading off of 128, and you go around that rotary that's got the little lines. Can everybody figure those lines out? They had a guy write a letter to the Wakefield item, and he says those lines came from some guy that was out there with a bucket of paint and a bottle of Jack Daniels. And he just painted those lines, because there is more accidents out there with those lines. It's absolutely a nightmare. But anyway, that was, they took, that was not designed when they built 128. That rotary was not there. So they abandoned the Main Street North, right where the veterinarians are. They dead-ended it right there. And then they took Lowell Street, they moved that, they shoved that around. It kind of looks like if you look at it, it's kind of, they just jiggled this thing around a little bit, but they did get that, they got those streets connected. And then they went from, I mean, it's 2 lanes going north, but then they added another lane going through, and it's kind of confusing. But anyway, they went from 2 lanes to 6 lanes, and then there's 8 lanes, and then they were using the breakdown. Anybody remember the breakdown lanes? Yeah. Before they widened the road? That was a nightmare. You go down the breakdown lane, but people were coming out of the exits on the acceleration lanes, and you're on the breakdown lane. It was totally crazy. And then, of course, we had that little thing called the Big Dig. And that was, I just dug this like up today. 1982, they started doing the design work for the Big Dig, 1982. And they didn't start working on it until 1991, the actual construction. And that went to, that went to 2007. Wasn't that fun? You know, it was fun for me because I was working down the Cape most of the time, so I was driving through in my van with my camcorder on my shoulder. So I videotaped that whole thing going through Boston for at least 2 or 3 years. And someday, if I get old enough, I'll sit back and watch all that stuff. So, but that was the 128 story anyway, and all these roads going out and everything. But they were building a lot of roads pretty quickly. And doing the land taking and all the other stuff, and of course financing all the stuff. But it didn't hurt to have Volpe in there. He was the first director for that whole all that federal funding in 1956. Oh, by the way, 1919, there was a guy. He was a lieutenant colonel, I believe he was, Dwight Eisenhower. And it was his task to figure out, militarily wise, how long it would take to get a convoy from Washington, D.C. out to the West Coast. And it was a nightmare because they took that Lincoln Highway, and the trucks were bogged down in mud. It was just absolutely, it took them 68 days, I think, to get this convoy just out to California from Washington, D.C. And he was just a young soldier at the time. Well, anyway, Dwight became a very, very popular soldier because he was running the campaign over in World War II over in Europe. And he realized that the Autobahn was absolutely what we needed over in America to get troops from point A to point B. So he had that experience. He had that experience of trying to get out to the coast through the mud. And then, of course, he had the experience in World War II. And then he became the president. So in 1956, that was his campaign to get the state. It was more about transportation, but it was also military. It was a military application to this whole thing, and that's how they funded it, and that's how they sold it. That's how they got it through Congress and everything. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. And of course, they ruined a lot of cities going through. They just, right through cities with some of these highways. But they built, I forget how many thousands of feet of road. But it was really crazy. So that gets us to a little Wakefield right here. I was going to explain a little bit about going through Wakefield. So just as an example of any of these roads, actually, when you're on a road, thank you so much, thank you. I've only got 2 hours left to go. What happens is when you're on a highway like in Wakefield, for instance, like that was generally all flat. Before 128 was even thought of, that was pretty flat land. It wasn't up in New Hampshire with big roads and everything. So, but when you're driving now on that highway, you don't realize it, but you're going up and down and up and down. So basically, you're going over existing roads that were already there, and they had a bridge over these things. There's 8 underpasses, and just Wakefield alone, there's 8 underpasses that you're going over existing roads or train tracks, right? Or, for instance, there's only one bridge in Wakefield. That's Hopkins Street Bridge. And that bridge, as you're coming from Reading into Wakefield, that's the level of the land that was right there. That bridge was that was the land. They dug that whole thing out underneath it. They blasted the hell out of that thing to get through that. So that the bridge is where the land was, and everything down below it was all blasted out to get through there. And then they had to ride up over all these train tracks, the main line coming in from Reading and through Wakefield going into Boston. And then we had the Newburyport train tracks that they had to put a tunnel. You could actually, there's a tunnel underneath 128. You could drive a tractor trailer truck through. Nobody even knows about it because you're going up and over. But it's between the Salem Street exit and I believe the Main Street, Vernon Street exit. Somewhere right in the middle of that stuff. You can see the rails on either side. There's a big tunnel underneath there, and that was for the Newburyport line that started in Wakefield. It went all the way up there to Newburyport, and that train tracks, those tracks went in the 1850s. And that's going to be the new rail trail. Yeah, that's going to be the new rail trail or something. So it's really interesting how they maneuvered all this stuff, the bridges, and of course they had different contractors. They had probably, I don't know how many contractors, but they let out a lot of different contracts when they built 120. It wasn't one contractor doing the whole job. There was several contractors doing pieces of it, and they just connected all the dots. Same thing with the Mass Pike. They did that. Does anybody remember the Nike base that was in Reading?
Oh, yes.
Right. Okay, and you guys, over Bear Hill, that's where they just built a bunch of apartment houses up there. But that's where the housing was. They just took those houses down a few years ago. That was for the military houses, but there was also the mess hall up there, all the controls stuff. But the launch pads, you know where the launch pads were? You know where the Burbank ice rink is? That's where all the rockets were. So,
Yep.
Yep. You remember that? Yeah. That's where the rockets were. And so they built these Nike bases. They built dozens and dozens and dozens. There was one in Danvers. There was one in Nahant. They were all over the place. And we were afraid. They were afraid that the Russian bombers that were flying 50,000 feet up in the air were going to come. It was a Cold War. They thought we were going to get attacked. So they built these Nike bases to shoot missiles up at the bombers. And so there was a story I just read about Mr. Burbank. Does anybody know him?
No.
Philanthropist from Reading.
Anyway, there was a Burbank, right? And he said you could drive a semi-trailer underneath where those launch pads were, underneath that ice skating rink. He says they had a big, huge complex in there, and that's where they would load they would load those missiles up. And so all the controls and all the people that were based with that base, they were over where Hopkins Road is, where it goes right. Hopkins Street goes right over there, right up on that hill. So that was just, that's just one thing. Another thing I found out was the bridge that's in Gloucester that goes over, we're going to cut it short here in about 2 seconds here, but the bridge that goes over, the Platte Bridge that goes over 128 and goes into Gloucester, that big bridge. Yeah. Well, the bridge they took out was that bridge had a, what do they call those things when they drawbridge. A drawbridge. There was a drawbridge, and that thing used to open up like 30 to 75 times a day. Wow. So could you imagine going up to Cape Ann or coming back? Because that's exactly, so that's what they took out. So when they put that bridge in, that was pretty cool. And they were really they wanted to bring, they left the exit, when they doing the exit numbers, 1 through 8 wasn't, they started with exit 9 up there. Because they were going to bring it into Rockport. I don't know what the hell they were thinking about, but they were thinking of doing that anyway. Anyway, anybody any questions? Go ahead.
So, do you recall the battle 25 years ago of trying to deal with the 128-93 interchange in Stoneham?
Oh, I got all the paperwork for that.
Because it's one of the most dangerous interchanges. I'm in public health, so those statistics have come my way. So that never materialized, but it is still a very dangerous, major highway interchange between 128 and 93 in Woburn and Stoneham, and they fought to the death, and it never went through.
I'm glad you brought that up because I just found I for some reason or other I've been saving all that stuff, and I got a whole pile. It was scheme A, B, C, and D. They had different schemes for that thing. But what we're talking about is where 93 and 128 is. They were going to take a bunch of land taking. It was going to be it looked like Los Angeles, but by the time they get done with that. It's absolutely insane. But they were you're right, that is a crazy intersection up there. They just had a truck on the overpass tip over this morning. And blocked, I think they blocked 2 or 3 lanes. What else we got? Any more questions? Go ahead.
Just a comment, the modern environmental movement is, people date it to 1970, Earth Day and things, rivers catching on fire. So when you talk about building the Mass Pike in 2 years, this was before there were environmental impact statements and so forth. I mean, for better or for worse, right? Like you said, they just went.
Oh, they didn't have the.
It would take forever to get.
Oh no, no, you're 100% correct. They did not have the. They didn't have the. Even when they built Pleasure Island,
Yeah.
they just pushed. I mean, they were just filling in swamps. I mean, it was just crazy. They didn't have the. They didn't have the protections that came in, but basically that stuff kicked in the 70s at some point or other. Yeah, sure, absolutely. No, you're 100% right. They just they just blew right through. I mean, it was just amazing. Matter of fact, I'm glad you brought that up. There's a great YouTube on the building of the Mass Pike. It was done by the authority. Okay, it was a little. It's kind of like that 50s thing. Okay, we're going to take your little farm, but you're going to be better off because you'll be able to get all your milk to market because we're going to put you in another farm over here. And they got. It's pretty interesting. I think it's about an hour long, but they actually went through there. They had a cameraman as they're building that whole thing. It was pretty amazing. If you hop on YouTube, there's a bunch of different things, but that's one of them that I really recommend. There's another one called Trails. I think it's Roads and Trails in early Massachusetts. That I watched was really interesting because they talk about all these about the post roads and all the trails that they started with that were literally thousands of years old. When they started developing this country. So I think we're probably going to wrap it up. But go ahead.
I just wanted the 2 things.
No extra charge for this one.
The 2 things that I know and heard about here in North Reading on 128 is that a lot of the sand needed for fill on 128 was harvested with all the behind the Jackson Farm here on Havel Street in North Reading.
Mm-hmm.
And the a giant steam shovel, which is used to excavate it, is still there.
Is it still there right now?
Yes, still there right now, even as we speak. Is an ancient relic, and that there's a little house at the corner of on Havel Street at the corner of North Street, a little now painted kind of a sage green, and I understand that was a house that was in the way of 128 in Wakefield and was carried up the street and moved there to.
Really?
It'd be really nice if if they had. I mean, it would be a really interesting concept to do an overlay on all this stuff on how they created these streets and roads over time and stuff like that. But I'm not going to do it. Mr. Cameraman's going to do it, but I'm not going to do it. All right. Oh, one last thing. I almost forgot. I mentioned it early on. Quantipower Parkway was a concept that they needed to. They wanted to eliminate cars going through Wakefield Center. This is in 1911. They decided they were going to do this because they were having problems even back then. So in 1916, the state came in and they took a big swath of land at the head of Lake Quantipower, right where that pathway is. Mm-hmm. Right now they're building the building behind it, but they took I forget how many feet, but they took a lot of footage right across the whole swath of that lake, and they filled it in 1920. 1923 is when the filling took place. Oh no, actually I think that 1926 they filled it in, and they went across it when it was ice. They backed trucks in. They came down from. They were grabbing fill about where Camp Curtis Guild is, mm-hmm. and they were backing in and they were filling it on ice. And then they came in on North Ave. They were bringing wood. Fill down. I think where the Galvin School is, somewhere down there. They were bringing fill in, and they were filling. Anyway, they filled the whole thing in, and they built the parkway. That's what that Quantipower Parkway is right now, and it went right straight across from North Ave all the way to the other side. And then they connected. They did the same thing. They put a bunch of signs up, and they got people from the South Shore coming up through Stono, I believe. And they came down by Crystal Lake where the pumping station is, and then they came down North Ave, and then they went across the lake on that boulevard, and then back up to the North Shore because there was no 128. So what I'm getting at is when 128 opened, that became obsolete. Okay, and they gave it to the town for $1. And then American Mutual came in 55 and said, boy, this would be a swell place to build a building. And that opened up in 1958 with 800 employees, that American Mutual building. And the guy that was the architect for that building, here at the Mapatorium in Boston.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, the architect, yeah, exactly. The architect for that Mapatorium was the architect for that American Mutual building. And it was really gorgeous in there. And as you know, they tore that down. 440 apartments. Just what we need. Well, thank you, everybody. Well, this was fun. You learn a lot, but seriously, if you have a chance, pick up some of those old maps when you're in your local little antique store, and you can have some fun. You can see where these roads went, right? Because it's absolutely crazy. My head's going to explode when you think about all the work that they did for just a matter of really a couple of decades, actually. Something like that. Now we get traffic. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much, Bob.